Well, thank you for joining us today. It's an honor to be here talking about Tom's legacy and what he conveyed through his mentorship to us. We strive for the evolution of our science through advances in theory. And I think there's really something special about being able to track that evolution in the relationship between a mentor and a mentee. Because you know when you see it, that relationship was meaningful, that mentorship was given, it was received, and that from it something new was born. Our science evolved. My favorite times with Tom were our brainstorming sessions. I mean, really they were probably just regular weekly meetings, but they all seemed to form brainstorming sessions, and especially about all things dynamic systems. And I think the best word to describe them was synergistic. It's that energy you have where you're not only on the same wavelength, but there's just this really rich, inspiring exchange of ideas where you're creating something new. It's exciting, it's fun, and that was really a gift that I got in my relationship with him and in his mentorship, that kind of inspiration. And so I'm hoping to share a little bit of that with you today. So what I'm going to address particularly in terms of theoretical contributions is the coercion model. And as you know, this was developed by Jerry Patterson in the 70s as he was studying coercion in couples, and in the 80s was applying it to coercion in families. And for those, I'm sure you're all familiar, but I'm just going to briefly go through the coercive cycle so that we're all on the same page. This cycle often starts with child misbehavior, which the parent then responds to, usually with a limit set, saying no, or making a particular request. The child may refuse or ignore that request. The parent may escalate, get irritable, yell. The child may also escalate in terms especially of negativity, negative affect, maybe leading up to tantrum. And then we get to this moment where the parent either kind of relinquishes the limit that they've set and gives up, or maybe succeeds with their escalated hostility in getting the child to stop their aversive behavior. So either way, you've kind of reinforced this coercive cycle. If the parent gives up, he or she's negatively reinforcing the child's aversive behavior. If the parent succeeds, it's reinforcing that parent's hostility and escalation, right? And so we have this cycle, and Jerry talked about this as being a training ground for the development and maintenance of aggressive behavior and antisocial behavior. So in the 80s, Tom, his mentee, joined him in writing about coercion in relation to child antisocial behavior, and was especially interested in this in boys, and especially extensions to peers in relation to his interest in peer processes, deviancy, delinquency. And he argued that coercive processes acted as functional mechanisms for the development of antisocial behavior, and really this role that they played as a function for the system. He also emphasized the patterning of coercive process within time, across time, and within and across context. So for example, thinking about this interplay between disrupted discipline and irritable microsocial interactions in the dyad. And what I really want to draw your attention to here is this emphasis on inter-subsystem relations that really ties into dynamic systems theory and principles. So really getting at kind of how the individual and the dyad interacted, or two dyadic subsystems interacted. Specifically, given his interest in peer processes, and again, deviancy and delinquency, he theorized about how coercive interactions in the home were then transferred to peer context. So just as an example of some of his empirical work in terms of putting this theory to the test, this is from a 1994 paper where he really looked at the interface of the parent-child coercive process and the child-peer coercive process. This was pretty innovative for the time. This is a period of time where dynamic systems theory is really just being adopted by developmental psychologists. And I want to note, too, that he did so not just looking at macro ratings of family processes, which were more the norm up to that time, but really getting at these kind of microsocial dynamic processes and looking at rates per minute and things like that. And so getting into modeling these dynamic processes in a more ecologically valid way. And he really talked about this in terms of dynamic systems principles. He highlighted open systems and the way that these, when we think about dynamic systems, we think about hierarchically nested subsystems in the family, the way they interface with one another, and through their interactions build stability and function or dysfunction over time. So he talked about these processes directly. And his work over the years really continued to reflect this very systemic thinking about coercive processes and really laid the foundation for a lot of his scientific contributions, including, as we all know, his prevention work. There was an excellent symposium this morning about the contributions of the family checkup. And so here's an example of this from the Early Steps Research Group, showing how the family checkup has shown effects in terms of reduction of children's behavior problems from age 2 to 4 through targeted improvements in positive parenting. And the intervention effects were strongest among families who had the highest child behavior problems at entry at age 2. And so I think this is another important thing to highlight, is that it's this rich thinking about coercive processes that likely underlaid the development of this model that made it effective for those families that were most in need, and particularly those maybe at highest risk for coercion with these higher levels of child behavior problems. So, I was inspired by a lot of these ideas, and especially the dynamic systems principles underlying his work. And so in thinking about how I'm carrying this forward, sort of into the future, I'm going to highlight dynamic systems principles and theory and methods and how we're implementing them into our work today. In order to do that, I need to mention a few dynamic systems principles within about, a minute. I'm going to talk about 3 dynamic systems principles, but even though this is going to be quick and brief, happy to refer you to papers or anything else if you want to talk about them more after the fact. And I'm just going to highlight 3 and then outline 3 papers that map onto each of these principles and show how we're kind of moving these ideas forward. So one of these is control parameters, which are really these factors that interact to drive functioning in a system and really control kind of what behavior pattern emerges or the form in which the behavior pattern emerges. And what I'm going to highlight is this idea of parent self-regulation as a particular control parameter governing the coercive cycle. I'm also going to talk about attractors. In a self-organizing system, the system tends to fall into certain preferred behavioral states, a small number of preferred behavioral states. So these states kind of attract the behavior towards them, which then attracts it away from other states in the system. And so I'll talk about the coercive cycle as an attractor of something that repeats itself and becomes more likely and stable over time. And then variability. In dynamic systems theory, variability actually can mean and refer to multiple things. What I'm going to highlight today is the cases in which it may signify disorganization or disequilibrium in the system, and especially in terms of inconsistency in the parent and dyad. Okay, so just a little bit about each of these 3 papers before I dig in. As I mentioned, we're really kind of going to highlight parent self-regulation and parent-child co-regulation in this work. Paper 1 is about breaking down the coercive cycle into its sequence in real time and highlighting the role of parent self-regulation deficits. Paper 2 is about thinking about dynamic co-regulation effects, thinking of co-regulation as an attractor, and how it's affecting harsh parenting and child behavior problems over time. So starting to get a proxy of these transactional processes that play out across development. And paper 3 is examining how individual discipline in the parent and dyadic variability or inconsistency in the dyad interact to shape children's externalizing behavior over time. So I would say that the coercive cycle hinges upon a regulatory deficit in the parent, particularly in those cases where it's that moment that the parent gives up the agenda that they've set or the limit that they've set. And it's this relinquishment, this moment where they're not able to persist at their goals, or they can't delay until they're overwhelmed by the aversiveness of the situation, or maybe there's a deficit in terms of delay of gratification. And it's this moment that governs the repetition of this coercive cycle. And in this sense, it becomes a control parameter that governs the stability of this dyadic pattern. I was also thinking about the coercive literature, and there's a lot that shows that there's both rigidity and kind of harsh repeated commands when we think about harsh parents and coercion, but there's also a lot of indiscriminate and inconsistent behavior. Frances has written a bunch about this herself. And how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of the fact that there's both rigidity and repetition and inconsistency? So we broke down the coercive cycle into its sequence and asked how parents respond to child misbehavior episodes in real time and how this response varied by common risk factors for coercion, namely parent hostility and child externalizing behavior. We applied multi-level survival analysis to study these temporal dynamics, which have been applied in issues of parent-child and family aggression before. And I don't have full time to describe multi-level survival analysis either, but just as a plug for dynamic systems methods. A traditional survival analysis looks at sort of time and predictors to death in this small figure on the left. And so death is the behavior of interest, and we're looking at differential predictors in terms of the latency or the probability of that outcome happening. So you can think of this when we apply it to continual behavioral interactions as if there's, we pick a behavior of interest, maybe it's parent harsh response, and then we look at multiple deaths, right? Many, many little curves, and aggregate those kind of probability and latency across the interaction to see what is driving that moment, that response. So in this case, what we were actually interested in was variability and change in parental disciplinary strategy. So we were looking at how often that changed in response to these time-varying and time-invariant predictors. So overall, parent behavior was less likely to change when children were off task. So in typical families in the whole sample, when children misbehave, parents tended to stick to their guns and set one limit and stick with it. But when that parent response was negative, that was no longer true. So then the parent disciplinary strategy started to change when the parents themselves were being negative. Also in dyads that were high on both hostility and externalizing behavior, we also saw that kind of variability in disciplinary response. And in fact, we saw an overall opposite pattern where they were much more rigid when the child was on task and behaving, and variable and inconsistent when the child was off task and in behaving. So here we see this moment in this cycle where in the face of child misbehavior, when parent self-regulation is really needed, those parents are really struggling, and it might explain some of the ineffectiveness and inconsistency in that discipline. In the second paper, as I mentioned, we were looking at coercion as an attractor, which lends itself towards stability over time. And my interest was really in, well, okay, we know this a little bit already. We know that those attractors, those negative attractors, are becoming stronger here. But that may mean that positive attractors are becoming weaker. And really, it's those positive moments between parent and child that we want to target and build on an intervention. So how can we learn more about what's happening there and how that's playing a role in the coercive cycle across development? So first, we asked whether harsh parenting weakened dynamic coupling of positive processes between parent and child. Then whether this compromised positive co-regulation predicted future harsh parenting and child externalizing problems. In other words, is it not just the coercion that's predicting these things over time, but the weaker positive processes that are also doing so? And then we looked at directionality from mother to child and child to mother to see if that made a difference. So we used the dynamic method of hidden MARKOV modeling to model this coupling, and the positive processes of interest were maternal autonomy support and child autonomous behavior. In other words, when parents are offering support for that autonomy, we hope that the child makes use of that support and then shows that corresponding autonomous behavior. And when they show that behavior, we hope the parent follows it up with support of that very same behavior. These were observed assessments at age 3, predicting outcomes at age 4, and both maternal and paternal harsh parenting were included in this model to get a more comprehensive picture. So we found that indeed both maternal and paternal harsh parenting were related to this poor or weaker coupling of autonomy support and autonomous behavior in the mother-child dyad. But really it was mother's response to child that drove effects over time. When children were doing what they were supposed to be doing and showing this autonomous behavior, and the mothers did not support them immediately afterwards or contingently afterwards, that was related to increased maternal harsh parenting and child internalizing and externalizing behavior problems over time. So it gave us a little bit of a sense of this landscape of the dyad, that there's both positive and negative processes going on, and that both could potentially be contributing to the stability of this coercive attractor over time. And finally, this last paper, this is the thesis work of one of my students, Kayla Brown. This study was really getting at what we already know about children with difficult temperaments being likely to receive harsher parenting and be likely to exacerbate externalizing behavior problems. What is the role of dyadic inconsistency in that? So we can think about this as if the parent is inconsistent and the child's at a prime developmental stage for developing self-regulation skills, but the parent is inconsistent, what can they anchor on in those interactions? It may lend itself to both the child and parent being more inconsistent and creating that sort of inconsistent dyadic context. So we looked at the moderation of harsh parenting on the link between difficult temperament and externalizing, but then also performed a moderated moderation of this by dyadic inconsistency. Is dyadic inconsistency also exacerbating these processes to lead to higher externalizing problems? So this dynamic analysis had to do with state space grids. I won't have a lot of time to explain those here, but you can refer to these papers and others. We applied state space grids to study dyadic variability again in goal-directed behavior in the form of parental guidance and discipline and child compliance and noncompliance. And so this variability is displayed in a dyadic grid where we're seeing variability and inconsistency in those dyadic states. And then applied our moderation. And what we found is that at high levels of harsh parenting, dyadic inconsistency didn't make an enormous difference, as you can see in the graph on the right. But at mean and low levels of harsh parenting, it did make a difference, where higher dyadic inconsistency was related to higher externalizing problems for those children with difficult temperaments. And so really what this showed us is that there's the possibility of these two pathways, one via harsh parenting and one via dyadic inconsistency, and that there may be these differential pathways by which these processes are stabilizing and children are showing higher behavior problems. So in summary, I'm carrying forward some of Tom's training and emphases that I learned so richly from him in terms of ecological validity and really looking at these dynamic processes with dynamic modeling at the micro level. The functional developmental mechanisms, what role are these behaviors serving for the system? And in terms of dynamic systems, really delving deeper and trying to unpack some of those and apply some of those principles and features to this work so that we can better understand these processes and therefore better intervene on these processes. I think parent self-regulation we know it's important and yet it's still understudied to date, and I think we need to put a little more emphasis on that. I think we need to think about the dyad as a unit of analysis that in itself changes and grows over time. And what's this function of variability? Maybe it's not just noise. Maybe we need to pay attention to the variability in the system if we really want to think about better targets for intervention, more effective targets. So it was an honor to learn from Tom, to be inspired by him, and I'm just hoping to kind of continue evolution of these ideas as I carry them forward in the future and with the help of my mentees as well. Thank you.